The heat didn't just sit on the skin, it pushed. It was a heavy, invisible hand pressing Silas Thorne into the scorched leather of his saddle as he crested the rise overlooking Blackwater Wash. The air tasted of alkali and dried blood, a familiar copper tang that had followed him from the trenches of Tennessee all the way to this god-forsaken stretch of the Arizona Territory. Below, the town of Oakhaven looked like a collection of discarded matchboxes bleaching in the sun. It was a lie of a name. There wasn't an oak tree for 50 miles, only twisted mesquite and the sharp, unforgiving needles of the saguaro. Silas felt the weight of the silver star in his pocket, unpinned and cold. It felt heavier than the Colt Peacemaker thumping against his thigh with every rhythmic step of his roan. He wasn't here for the law, though the law was the only thing he knew how to wear. He was here for the debt that had been festering in his gut for 6 years, a wound that refused to scar over. His horse, a weary beast named Cinder, let out a low, rattling breath. Silas patted the animal's neck, feeling the salt-crusted hair and the frantic pulse beneath the hide. They were both running on fumes and ghosts. He looked at his hands. They were steady, but the grime under his fingernails looked like dried soil from a fresh grave. He shifted his weight, his spurs giving a lonely, metallic clink that seemed to echo too loud in the oppressive silence of the canyon. As he descended into the wash, the shadows of the rock walls stretched out like long, skeletal fingers. The sun was a dying ember, bleeding orange and violet across the horizon, casting the world in a bruised light. He reached the first shack on the outskirts of town, a leaning structure of rotted pine. A woman stood on the porch, her face hidden in the shade of a wide-brimmed hat. She was snapping green beans into a tin bucket, the rhythmic crack-pop sounding like distant pistol fire. Silas didn't stop, but he felt her eyes track him, a silent judgment that made the hair on his neck prickle. The main street was a wind-scoured gauntlet of shuttered windows and swaying signs. The hanging lantern saloon flickered with a weak yellowish light, its swinging doors groaning on rusted hinges. Silas dismounted, his boots hitting the dust with a soft thud that felt like a finality. He didn't tie Cinder to the rail. The horse wouldn't go anywhere, and Silas wasn't sure he'd be the one riding out. He pushed through the doors, the smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies heading him like a physical blow. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm, where the only sound is the settling of dust and the ticking of a wall clock that lost its hands years ago. He walked to the bar, his spurs singing a jagged tune against the floorboards. The bartender was a man with a face like a crumpled map, eyes buried deep in folds of leathery skin. He didn't reach for a glass. He just looked at Silas's chest where the star should have been, then up at his eyes. Silas saw the recognition flicker there, a spark of fear dampened by a weary indifference. The bartender's hand moved slowly under the counter, a calculated shift that Silas tracked without turning his head. "Water," Silas said, his voice like gravel grinding on stone, "and a bottle of whatever won't blind me." The bartender hesitated, then set a cracked ceramic pitcher on the wood. Silas poured a glass, the water cloudy and warm. He drank it in one go, the liquid doing nothing to soothe the burning in his throat. He felt the stare of a man in the corner, a tall, angular figure in a duster the color of dried mud. His hat was pulled low, but the glint of a brass-handled knife tucked into his belt was unmistakable. "You're late, Thorne," the man in the corner said. The voice was thin, reedy, but carried the weight of an old threat. Silas didn't turn. He watched Elias's reflection in the grime-streaked mirror behind the bar. It was Elias Vance, a man Silas had left for dead in the mud of a rainy night in Georgia. Elias should have been a memory, a ghost to be exorcised with a bottle and a prayer. Instead, he was sitting there, whittling a piece of soft wood with a blade that looked sharp enough to cut the air. Silas poured a shot of whiskey, the amber liquid trembling slightly in the glass. "Death didn't take to you, Elias. You always were too bitter to swallow." Elias laughed, a dry, hacking sound that ended in a cough. He stood up, the chair legs screeching against the floor. He walked toward Silas with a practiced predatory grace, stopping just outside of arm's reach. The tension between them was a physical thing, a taut wire stretched to the breaking point. "I didn't come back for the scenery," Elias whispered, leaning in. The smell of tobacco and rot wafted off him. Silas could see the scar running from his ear to his collarbone, a jagged reminder of the saber that had nearly claimed him. Elias's hand hovered near his belt, his fingers twitching. Silas's own hand was a dead weight by his side, ready to wake up. They stood there, inches apart, the air between them thick with the things they hadn't said 6 years ago. Elias almost reached out to touch the heavy wool of Silas's coat, his hand stopping mid-air, trembling with an unspoken fury. He almost spoke a name, a woman's name, but the words died in his throat as the saloon doors swung open again. A young man, barely 20, stumbled in, his face pale and slick with sweat. He held a crumpled telegram in one hand and a revolver in the other. His eyes were wide, darting between Silas and Elias like a trapped animal. "The riders are coming," the boy gasped, his voice cracking. "They're coming for the girl." The bartender finally pulled a short-barreled shotgun from under the bar, laying it across the wood with a heavy clack. The shift of power was instantaneous. Silas wasn't the hunter anymore. The room was filled with prey. He looked at Elias, and for a fleeting second the old bond of the regiment flickered in their eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold reality of the present. "Who's she, kid?" Silas asked, his voice low and steady. The boy didn't answer. He just pointed toward the back of the saloon, where a heavy oak door sat bolted and barred. Silas felt a cold dread settle in his marrow. He walked toward the door, his boots heavy. He reached for the bolt, his fingers brushing the cold iron. He almost slid it back, almost turned the handle to see what they were protecting, but a hand clamped onto his wrist. It was Elias. His grip was like a vice. "You don't want to see what's behind that door, Silas. Some things are better left in the dark." Silas stared at him, seeing the desperation in the other man's eyes. He twisted his wrist, breaking the hold, and for a moment they almost grappled, 2 old dogs fighting over a bone of a secret. But the sound of galloping horses outside cut through the tension. Multiple riders, fast and heavy. Silas turned away from the door and walked to the window, peeling back a moth-eaten curtain. In the fading light, he saw 6 men on horseback, silhouetted against the purple sky. They weren't lawmen, and they weren't outlaws. They wore long black coats that looked like funeral shrouds, and they rode with a grim military precision. The leader stopped his horse in the center of the street, the beast's hooves churning up a cloud of dust that hung in the still air. The leader didn't call out. He just sat there, a silent statue of vengeance. Silas felt the silver star in his pocket. He took it out and looked at it. It was dented, the points blunted by time and regret. He looked at the boy, who was now sobbing silently in the corner, his revolver shaking in his hand. This wasn't a town, it was a trap, and Silas had walked right into the center of it. He looked back at the door in the rear of the saloon. "Who is she?" Silas asked. Elias didn't look at him. He was busy checking the cylinders of his own pistol. "She's the only thing left of the 5th Cavalry," Elias mired. "The only one who knows where the gold was buried before the massacre." Silas felt a jolt of recognition. The gold. The reason 100 men had died in a shallow creek bed while he had watched from the ridge, unable to move. He'd always told himself he was pinned down by enemy fire. He'd told the court-martial that he was out of ammunition. He'd told the widows that their husbands died as heroes. But the truth was simpler and far more poisonous. He'd stayed on the ridge because he was afraid. He'd watched the slaughter because his legs had turned to lead. And Elias, the man he thought he'd tried to save, knew the truth. Elias had seen him through the smoke. The first bullet shattered the saloon window, glass spraying across the floor like diamonds in the dirt. The boy screamed and dove behind a table. Silas was on the floor before the second shot rang out, his peacemaker drawn and cocked. The room was suddenly filled with the smell of burnt powder and the screams of the dying. The bartender took a hit to the chest, falling backward into his shelves, bottles of rye and bourbon sashing down on him in a sticky, flammable deluge. Silas crawled toward the bar, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw Elias crouched behind a heavy oak pillar, firing back with a rhythmic, deadly calm. "They've got us pinned, Thorne, just like the creek." The words were a knife in Silas's gut. He looked at the rear door again. If the girl was in there, she was a dead woman if they stayed. He had to move. He had to be the man he had pretended to be for 6 years. He lunged for the boy, grabbing him by the collar and dragging him toward the back. "Get that door open," Silas barked. The boy fumbled with the bolt, his fingers slick with blood from a glass cut. Silas stood over him, firing out the shattered window to give him cover. He saw one of the black-coated riders slump in his saddle and fall, his foot catching in the stirrup as the horse bolted, dragging the body down the street. It was a grisly, chaotic dance. The door finally gave way. Inside was a small, windowless room lit by a single candle. A girl, no older than 12, sat on a crate, her eyes wide and dark. She wasn't crying. She looked at Silas with a terrifying clarity. In her lap sat a leather-bound journal, its edges charred. Silas felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't about gold. He knew that journal. It belonged to the colonel. It was the record of every order, every betrayal, and every cowardice committed during the campaign. If that book got out, Silas's life, the fragile, respectable life he'd built as a frontier marshal, would vanish. He'd be lucky to end up at the end of a rope. He looked at the girl, then at the journal. He almost reached for it, almost snatched it from her small hands to toss it into the growing fire at the bar. He saw Elias watching him from the doorway, a grim smile on his face. Elias knew exactly what Silas was thinking. "What's it gonna be, Marshal?" Elias asked, the title dripping with sarcasm. Save the girl or save the lie? The riders were inside the saloon now, the sounds of boots on wood and the sharp cracks of close-quarters fire filling the air. Silas looked at the girl. She held the book out to him, a silent offering. He took it, the leather warm and smelling of old paper. He could feel the weight of 100 dead men in his palms. He looked at the candle, then at the book. He almost dropped it into the flame. He almost let the truth burn away forever. But the girl reached out and touched his hand, her fingers cold and small. "He said you'd come," she whispered. Silas froze. "Who?" The girl didn't blink. "My father. He said Silas Thorne was the bravest man he ever knew. He said you'd protect me." The lie was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. Her father had been the sergeant Silas had left to die in the mud, the man he'd watched get cut down while he sat safely on the ridge. Silas felt a sob catch in his throat, a jagged thing that tasted of salt. He didn't burn the book. He shoved it into his coat and grabbed the girl's hand. "We're leaving," he said, his voice cracking. "Elias, cover us." They ran for the back exit, a heavy door that led to the alleyway. Elias followed, his boots heavy and slow. As they burst into the night air, a rider swung around the corner of the building. Silas fired 3 times, the muzzle flashes blinding in the darkness. The rider tumbled back, but Silas felt a sharp, hot sting in his side. He didn't stop. He pushed the girl toward Cinder, who was waiting in the shadows, his ears pinned back in fear. "Get on," Silas yelled, hoisting the girl into the saddle. He turned to help Elias, but the man had stopped in the doorway. Elias was clutching his stomach, blood leaking through his fingers, dark and thick in the moonlight. He looked at Silas, his face pale and drawn. "I was never going to let you have it, Silas," Elias wheezed, a bloody grin stretching his lips. "I wanted to see you burn first. But the kid, she's got his eyes." Elias slumped against the doorframe, his strength failing. Silas reached out. his hand almost touching Elias's shoulder in a gesture of forgiveness, of shared pain, but a bullet from inside the saloon caught Elias in the throat. He fell forward, his eyes fixed on Silas, silent and accusing even in death. Silas wanted to scream, to run back into the fire and die with the only man who truly knew him, but the girl's hand was on his arm, pulling him toward the horse. He swung up behind her, his side burning like a hot iron was pressed against his ribs. He kicked Cinder into a gallop, the horse's hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. They raced out of Oakhaven as the saloon erupted in a fireball, the alcohol-soaked wood finally surrendering to the flames. The orange glow lit up the desert for miles, a funeral pyre for a town and a dozen secrets. They rode until the moon was high and cold, the silence of the desert returning like a shroud. Silas pulled the horse to a stop in the shadow of a high mesa. He dismounted, his legs buckling as he hit the ground. He leaned against a rock, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled the journal from his coat, the leather stained with his own blood. He looked at the girl, who was watching him with that same unnerving clarity. "You're hurt," she said, sliding off the horse. She moved toward him, her hands reaching for the wound in his side. He almost let her touch him, almost let her offer the comfort he didn't deserve, but he pulled away. He couldn't bear the kindness of a child whose father he had murdered through inaction. He opened the journal, the pages fluttering in the cold night wind. He didn't look for the gold, he looked for the date of the massacre. There, in his own handwriting, not the colonel's, was the truth. He hadn't been a witness. He had been the one who signed the retreat order. He had forged the colonel's signature while the old man lay dying in his tent, and he had sent the 5th Cavalry into the wash, knowing they were walking into an ambush. He hadn't just been a coward. He had been the architect of the slaughter. The gold wasn't for the army. It was his payment for the betrayal. The twist of the knife was that he had never collected it. He had been so consumed by the horror of what he'd done that he'd fled, leaving the money buried and the survivors to rot. And now, the men in the black coats, the remnants of the unit he'd betrayed, were hunting the only evidence left. He looked at the girl. She wasn't just a witness, she was the daughter of the man who'd discovered the forgery. He looked at the silver star in the dust at his feet. It was a hollow thing, a badge of shame. He reached for his canteen, but his hands were shaking too hard to unscrew the cap. He almost dropped it, but the girl took it from him, her small fingers working the metal. She held it to his lips, and he drank, the water tasting of copper and dust. He looked at her, seeing the ghost of the sergeant in the curve of her jaw. "Why didn't you tell them?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. The girl looked at the journal, then back at him. "Because my father told me to find you. He said you were lost, and I was the only one who could bring you home." The words were more painful than the bullet in his side. He wasn't being hunted for the gold. He was being hunted so he could finally face the truth. He heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. The black-coated riders hadn't given up. They were coming for the book, and they were coming for him. Silas looked at the girl, then at the horse. There was only enough strength left in Cinder for one rider to make it to the border. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the star, pressing it into the girl's hand. "Take this," he said. "If anyone stops you, tell them you're the marshal's daughter." He almost hugged her, almost held her close and begged for forgiveness she couldn't give, but he pushed her toward the horse. "Ride south. Don't look back. Don't ever look back." He slapped Cinder's flank, and the horse bolted into the darkness, the girl's small figure disappearing into the shadows of the mesa. Silas stood alone in the cold, the wind whistling through the rocks like the sighs of the dead. He sat down against the rock, his peacemaker in his hand. He watched the horizon, where the first flickers of torchlight were appearing. He felt the journal in his lap, the pages heavy with the weight of 100 lives. He took a match from his pocket and struck it against the stone. The flame was small and fragile, but it grew as he touched it to the corner of the book. The paper curled and blackened, the ink of his lies turning to ash and smoke. As the riders drew closer, their silhouettes sharp against the rising moon, Silas felt a strange peace. The heat of the fire was gone, replaced by the biting chill of the desert night. He raised his pistol, but not to fire. He looked at the cylinder, seeing the empty chambers. He had used his last bullets in the saloon. He was out of ammunition, just like he'd lied about all those years ago. But this time, it was the truth. The first rider reached the base of the mesa, his black coat fluttering like a raven's wings. He pulled his rifle from his scabbard, the lever clicking with a cold, mechanical finality. Silas didn't move. He just watched the smoke from the burning journal drift up toward the stars, a gray ghost in the moonlight. He almost closed his eyes, almost let the darkness take him before the end, but he kept them open. He wanted to see it coming. The bullet didn't make much noise. It was just a sharp crack that echoed once and then died away. Silas felt a sudden, cold bloom in his chest, a sensation of weightlessness that made the world tilt. He slumped against the rock, his head falling back. The riders didn't approach. They just sat on their horses watching him from the shadows, a silent jury. They didn't need the book anymore. They had the man.
Silas looked up at the stars, which seemed brighter and colder than they had ever been. He thought of the girl, riding toward a border he would never cross. He thought of Elias, waiting in the dark with a bottle and a jagged grin. He felt the desert sand beneath his fingers, coarse and indifferent. It was the only thing that would remember him. The wind picked up, scattering the ashes of the journal across the wash, erasing the last of the evidence. The moon climbed higher, casting a long, lonely shadow from the rock where Silas Thorne sat. He looked like he was just resting, a weary traveler taking a moment before the next leg of a long journey. But the silver star in the girl's hand was miles away, and the man who had worn it was gone. The desert didn't care about debts or gold or the names of the dead. It only cared about the silence, and the silence was absolute. As the riders finally turned their horses and melted back into the night, the only sound left was the dry rustle of the mesquite. The fire had gone out, leaving only a small, charred circle in the dirt. Silas's hand dropped to his side, his fingers brushing the empty holster. He had finally run out of lies. He had finally run out of time. The weight in his chest was gone, replaced by a hollow lightness that felt like the first breath of a long-delayed sleep. The sun would rise in a few hours, bleaching the world again, turning the bruised sky to a harsh, unforgiving white. It would find the remains of Oakhaven and the body of a man who had tried to outrun himself. But for now, there was only the cold and the dark and the lingering smell of burnt paper. The debt was paid, not in gold, but in the quiet, heavy stillness of a life finally surrendered to the truth. In the distance, a coyote howled, a thin, mourning sound that carried across the flats. It was an old song, one of hunger and survival, and the high price of both. Silas didn't hear it. He was already part of the silence, a ghost among ghosts, a name written in the shifting dust of the Arizona territory. The story was over, but the weight of it remained, a lingering pressure in the air that no wind could ever truly blow away. The girl would reach the border by dawn. She would carry the star and the memory of a man who had once been a coward, and in the end, something slightly less. She wouldn't understand the truth for years, and by then, the names in the journal would be nothing more than marks on a page. But she would remember the heat of the fire, and the cold of the desert, and the way the man had looked at her before he sent her away into the night. The riders would vanish into the hills, their vengeance satisfied, but their hearts no lighter. They were the shadows Silas created, and now they were all that was left of him.
the desert stretched out, vast and indifferent, a sea of sand and stone that had seen 1,000 betrayals and would see 1,000 more. It didn't offer peace, only an end, and for Silas Thorne, that was enough. The stars began to fade as the first gray light of morning touched the edges of the mesa. The world was cold and still, a landscape of bones and beauty. The body against the rock didn't move, its eyes fixed on a horizon it would never reach. The story of Silas Thorne was finished, leaving behind only the haunting, heavy echo of a man who had finally stopped running and found the only thing he had ever truly earned: the quiet.